Hi, everyone, and welcome to this morning's launch of the ELF publication, Human-Centered AI in the EU. My name is Robin Vetter. I work at the Green and Liberal think tank Forest in Stockholm, and I will be taking you through this launch event, which is streamed live from several locations all over the EU, actually, which is kind of interesting to me too. We will be joined today by several participants in the project. We will start by also having a small presentation from ELF on ELF's view on this project and the topic itself. After that, we will go on to hear from Stefan Larsson, who has been the lead project manager for this project, Jonas Andersson Schwarz and Claire Ingram Bogers, who have been editors. We will also hear from Fredrik Heinz, who is an AI researcher in Sweden, and Francesco Cappelletti, who is also connected to ELF, but is in Italy. So I think without further ado, I will ask Sharka to join and give a little presentation on ELF and why this is important. Sharka.
Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you on the behalf of the European Libera Forum and Forest to our human-centered AI in the EU discussion today. My name is Sharka Prat, and I am a board member of the European Libera Forum and executive director of the Czech think tank called the Institute for Politics and Society. The European Libera Forum is a political foundation that brings together almost 50 liberally oriented think tanks, institutions, and foundations from all over Europe. Together, we are creating a space for dialogue on European integration, liberal policies, ideas, and above all, the future of Europe. The purpose of this discussion is to debate the growing impact of artificial intelligence and the use of EU policy to ensure a human-centered approach moving into the future. Confronting the ethics and ensuring the meaningful regulation of artificial intelligence across the European continent is of paramount importance. The European Commission has put forward a set of guidelines for a collective approach to artificial intelligence and the technology sector. However, a national strategy for effective implementation across member states hasn't been as streamlined. This disparity is one of the central topics for our discussion today, and I firmly believe our dialogue will shed more light on many aspects of the relationship of AI and individual EU member states. As artificial intelligence systems continue to impact society and citizens, national strategies are attempting to capture economic prosperity and they remain competitive in the 21st century. In the world of artificial intelligence, keywords such as algorithms, automation, and big data are increasingly becoming commonplace as artificial intelligence becomes an accepted part of daily life for millions of people, both in the EU and globally. The European Union released a set of guidelines and recommendations for member states in the approach of artificial intelligence systems to maintain an ethical and trustworthy human-centered role. The EU stipulates that artificial intelligence is not an end in itself, but a tool that has to serve people with the ultimate aim of increasing human well-being. The question now is whether or not these guidelines have been influential in member states' policies for artificial intelligence moving into the future. The Czech Republic published the National Artificial Intelligence Strategy in May 2019, outlining tools and tasks with the Ministry of Industry and Trade being the main coordinating and review body. This analysis encompasses nearly all aspects of the EU guidelines, thought indirectly, with the aim of improving the country's economic growth and competitiveness in AI by creating favorable policy conditions. Industry 4.0 and artificial intelligence are quickly becoming the inevitable future of our world and finding the ability to effectively regulate and ensure that artificial intelligence remains a tool and humanity continues to remain the focus. Once again, I'm honored to welcome you to this discussion on behalf of the European Libera Forum, and I wish everyone an informative and pleasant discussion.
Thank you, Shaka. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. I would also like to just quickly point out that there was also a great discussion connected to this topic that you were arranging about a week ago, right? Yeah, good. And it can be found on the ELF website, if I'm not wrong.
Absolutely, on the ELF website and on the website of the Institute for Politics and Society and on the website of Slovenian Novum think tank. Yeah.
It's basically all over the internet then.
Yes.
Great. We will also be putting up a link to that in the aftermath of the event. So thank you. And I would now like to move on to soon leave the floor to Stefan Larsson. But I would just like to say that I find this topic very interesting because, as Shaka was talking about, we need to sort of view AI as a tool, not as a goal in itself. And with that just short thought, I would like to introduce first Stefan Larsson, who is an associate professor in technology and social change and lawyer at Lund University. And then right after you have given your presentation, we will be hearing from Claire Ingram Bogers, who is a researcher in digital entrepreneurship and digital strategy at Stockholm School of Economics and Gothenburg University. And also Jonas Andersson Schwarz, associate professor, media and communications at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. And the latter two have been involved as editors in this publication. And Stefan has been the main project manager for this publication, basically. So with that, I will leave it over to you, Stefan.
Hi, thanks. I'm really excited about this. It's been a project going on since almost 16, 18 months. My name is Stefan Larsson. I'm going to share my screen, by the way, and you might see a nice little presentation here. Yeah, like Sharka said, there's a value base in the European way of pursuing AI, and particularly so with regards to trustworthiness and ethics and human-centric, so human and the relationship to AI. This has caught my interest, particularly since the high-level expert group published their first ethics guidelines almost 1.5 years ago. So I started planning this project that summer, but I had to wait a while before the sort of member states strategies were published, and sort of when the EU and the EU's white paper was published in last February. But first I want to mention, and we're going to talk more with Claire and Jonas in a while. We've edited this volume that analyzes 9 different member states' AI strategies. We all represent universities in Sweden and also are affiliated to Forest. So we work jointly through Forest, you could say. Jonas and Claire will, we have a different backgrounds, right? So one financial sort of background from Claire, one media communication from Jonas, and me more social legal governance aspects. So I think that has made a good combination when looking at this, well, sort of ambitious project, because it's hard to get the grasp of, okay, what does it mean that EU moves in this way? And to what extent is that reflected at member state level? That's the key question for this volume. The translation or the reflection in member states, because much of the European way ahead will depend on to what extent member states agrees upon or strategizes in the same sense that the top central level of the EU does. Before I move on, I'm going to explain a little bit more of what Sharka already mentioned on the specific policies developed by, on the one hand, the Commission, and on the other hand, the high-level expert group that was appointed about a little bit more than 2 years ago to develop recommendations on AI in the EU. First of all, this type of grand overview cannot be done alone. So first of all, I want to thank my co-editors, but also the authors, right? I'm going to mention them more in specific. And we have also Francesco Capelletti, who wrote the Italian analysis with us today. Of course, European Liberal Forum, funding the project, Lawrence and Francesco also working there, and at Fondazione Luigi Einaudi. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but we also were intended to have workshop in Lisbon, which obviously didn't materialize during the spring. But I want you to check out Ricardo Silvestri's pod, because we're going to talk about this volume in that podcast. We already have done to some extent with Fredrik Heinz as well. And of course, Institute for Politics and Society, you met Sharka, but also Anna Sasa, who wrote the Czech Republic chapter in the book. And then, of course, Joachim, Ivan, and Tish, who helped out with sort of the production of the book, the layout, and the proofreading. Now, this volume has basically 3 parts, of which me, Jonas, and Claire have written the first chapter with this overarching presentation of, okay, what does EU mean with trustworthy AI? What does it mean with human-centered AI? And what that is based in. So it's not invented in the EU, you could say. It's part of more of an increased awareness on ethics aspects with AI. So EU has picked up on that sort of increased awareness, the relationship between AI and society, you could say. And Jonas and Claire will also develop that more, what that sort of critical and very important value-based version of AI implementation and development means. So we developed that in the first chapter, right? Then we invited Fredrik Heinz, who you will soon meet too. He is a computer scientist researcher and was part of the high-level expert group. So it's particularly relevant to have him to comment on this book and also comment on the European development, and both being like an expert in actual AI development, but also as part in the policy development within the EU. So more on that sort of commentary in a bit, but that's the first opening chapter in the book. Then the third section would be, well, that's the sort of the majority of the book, you could say. That's the 9 different countries. And you see them there, the Portugal, Poland, Norway, Nordics overall. We made that sort of overall analysis. And the Netherlands, Italy, and the Czech Republic. Now, one might think that, well, you miss some important countries or big countries, but to me, it's interesting to see, also look at the countries that not always get that focus from the international perspective that Germany and France gets, in a sense. So it's also interesting to understand sort of the transition from EU level to national level, to look at the countries that seem somewhat different from the big ones. So it's really interesting to see how Portugal moves, talks, behaves, and strategizes versus Poland or Czech Republic, for example. Norway might be perceived as why weird. Why are they here? They're not part of the EU. Well, they are part in this sort of governance realm, you could say, because they were also encouraged by the EU Commission in this coordinated plan, it was called, to develop strategies on AI. And Norway, by the way, were quite most recent of these, almost recent, very recent amongst these groups to produce an AI policy that was very clearly influenced by the ethics guidelines, by the way. So these are the 3 sort of sections of the book. Now, a little bit more on the overarching theme then, before we talk more about the actual ethics guidelines and such. Of course, which I already mentioned, sort of the value base, it's driving the analysis here. I'm thinking to me, it's extremely relevant, interesting, and also challenging to see that Europe has chosen this, well, the ethical, human-centered, and sort of trustworthy path to follow, which is slightly different on a geopolitical level than the US and China, which are other big players in AI. So to me, as a social legal researcher, I'm really intrigued by how does this sort of governance play out. It's not clearly regulatory. It's not, at least not yet, hardcore law in that sense. to be played out in the member states. It's a soft version of law, you could say, like a governance attempt, which then leads to the question, okay, to what extent does this land or get reproduced or be followed up in member states? If we spend a few minutes on the timing, because the timeline is relevant for how we understand the member state reflection of the central level, because the member states strategies were published in different times, and of course, if you publish early, you can't really be influenced by something that will be published later on a central level. But it started most clearly mid or early 18 with what we could call the AI strategy on European level, which also talked about the coming coordinated plan, which was released late 18. So that's, well, it's only 2 years ago, you could say. So it's been a swift movement in a sense. And in June 18, the high level expert group on AI was formally established with the primary goal, at least, to produce both the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which they had a draft version first of, and then finally published in April 19, and then the policy and investment recommendations for trustworthy AI, which was published slightly later in the mid 19. So these two, I would say, are the most key governing documents from the high-level expert group, which you see also corresponds to both sort of the funding ideas and trust ideas and human-centric ideas. In the commission, you see the communication in April 19 as well, but also picked up in the white paper in February this year. It feels like several years ago, but it's actually just February this year. Now, most member states, they were all sort of encouraged to publish their own AI strategies at least by mid-19. A majority may have reached that, but not all. So some have more, had already produced strategies, and they were not as clearly influenced, but that doesn't mean that all of the core notions were not in them. I mean, some countries had already clear ideas of openness and trust, for example, which we see in the Nordic chapter, by the way, although not explicitly sort of linked to the EU policy level. And lastly, which so these are the three key documents we've used to analyze the national member states with or through the ethics guidelines, the policy recommendations, and then the EU white paper, which is still hanging in the air in the sense that what does it mean in terms of regulatory issues, because that will come. And it's quite late in relationship to most member state strategies. But anyways, and I just want to point to these two. The purple one would be one last part of the ethics guidelines. That's more the self-assessment version. How, when you develop AI, what questions should you ask to assess that? So that sort of document is interesting as a sort of very pragmatic way of looking at these questions. And then the orange one is more sectoral considerations. That would be, okay, what about public sector? What about health sectors? And I think that will be the path to come, very much, to focus the more explicit sectors and their issues in relationship to human-centric and trustworthy AI. So we're in that step, you could say. Now, a few words on the key three documents then. To those of you who haven't looked at them that explicitly, the ethics guidelines, first of all, it explicitly says that, yeah, part of this is regulatory questions. We are not gonna deal explicitly with regulatory issues like law in this text. So we deal with robustness and we deal with ethics. And looking at ethics, they defined, Frederick and Pearce defined the sort of 4 overarching principles, which would be human autonomy, respect for that, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability, which to me is a word that you could translate to traceability and sort of communication issues. How do you make use of AI applied in a more transparent way? And then they move to a more pragmatic level. So when you want to realize trustworthy AI in real life, so to say, they produced 7 different elements to that. So human agency and oversight was very much key. And then technical robustness, privacy and data governance, which is interestingly enough very much a regulatory field anyways. Transparency, less clearly a regulatory field, but much interesting and picked up by the white paper, by the way, which I will show you in a second. Then diversity and non-discrimination, also very regulated field. Societal and environmental well-being, which I, to some extent, haven't seen that much of. I mean, talking about AI and environmental issues, I think it's that's a path I want to see more debate within. And then accountability, very much a legalistic terminology, often linked to transparency issues. So how do you know who to point fingers at? The other document is somewhat, you could say, richer, having much more points to it, divided into at least 8 groups. On the one hand, empowering and protecting humans in society, for example, so that would be the value base. But then also, of course, pointing to the private sector and for example, building data and infrastructure for AI, which could be linked, like B and E. And of course, also the public sector, which I see many indications on. That's a very important field to come. I see that in Sweden as well, with relevant national authorities developing policies on how to use AI in the public sector, and maybe more towards automated decision making and perhaps recommendation systems in the public sector. Very interesting field. And then of course the investment recommendations deals with how do you generate skills and education for AI, but also more importantly world-class research capabilities. These are issues Fredrik Heinz could also mention. I'm not sure what he will bring up later, but you see the funding and investment is at the same sort of level. So on the one hand, funding investment, developing industry, on the other hand, also make it trustworthy and human-centric. So the value, human societal value base. Lastly, of the 3 documents, we looked a bit at the white paper, which is very interesting and is pointing out some of the paths ahead. Those questions haven't really been answered yet, so that's something to look for in next year. I'm particularly keen on where the paper looks at what regulatory fields needs development, which we bring up in the first chapter, by the way, and maybe especially pointed to a lack of transparency or the issue of transparency in relationship to AI and autonomous systems. So some are so complex, it's hard to know how they were trained and how they reached the prediction they made or whatever sort of functionality they have. Sometimes it's more due to, you see point 3 and 4, that if you have a system that's developed and then changed and used in a different context, the data is in another context, then that adaptability, the retraining of the model, so to speak, poses some questions in terms of transparency and accountability. Who is to blame if you have a movement between different players in an adaptable and changing system? So those are sort of new and very interesting questions in terms of AI. So the accountability questions, you could say. Lastly, then, a little bit more focus on the member states before I turn over to Jonas and Claire. Of course, the timing I mentioned was really important to see, and you see Finland was really early. Sweden was early in this sense, but with a very sort of a limited version of strategy, not even called a strategy in Sweden, but an approach to. Mentioning, though, interestingly enough, some aspects of trustworthiness and sustainability in AI. And then you see the coordinated plan encouraged member states to have a strategy ready by mid-19, and some of the countries, for example, Portugal and Czech Republic and Denmark were quite early there. And even if, for example, the Portuguese one was just after the ethics guidelines in timing, it embraced and included some of the notions in the Portuguese strategy. And then we see strategies under development, for example, the Polish, and the last version is a draft version, which seemed to have been postponed during the COVID-19 spring, for example. But they published a draft just 2 months ago, which is rich and very relevant and very linked to the national level. So a very brief conclusion would be that, yes, much of the European development in AI will depend on member states. So how member states moves and embraces sort of a coordinated plan will sort of give the implications for how AI will be developed in Europe. So it's a sort of a distributed system, you could say. Maybe more so than, and I would assume without digging deeper into it, than the Chinese and the US version of AI strategies. So that's both probably a strength, but to some extent a weakness, because it's hard to coordinate. That's something that's really strong on member state level. But so just overarching conclusion would be that, yeah, it's very much depending on what member states move, how member states moves in this aspect. And not digging deeply here, this is the last slide, and I will hand over to Jonas, will be first out, I think. I want to thank Pedro and Kasia and Frans and Corey, Kasia, Francesco, we will talk to later, and Anas that I met at the event in Prague, Zoom Prague last week. So there are differences, and they are differently linked to the European level. I'm gonna stop that sharing and thank you. And now I'll come back in the panel, but before that, we hand over to Jonas, my co-editor. Jonas, please let us know your background and then your thoughts on this overarching project.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's been a pleasure. I hope that you can see me and hear me now, everyone. Yeah.
Yes.
And as co-editors, then me and Claire collaborated with Stefan and the other authors, and then we have a few takeaways here to present from our respective perspectives. I would say then my general orientation is to look at mediation of social action through digital technologies. That's kind of the essence of what I do as a media and communications scholar. And here it's obvious that a structural macro understanding of society is helpful. And I've looked at things like media policy, tech policy, and platform politics in my previous work. So this very nicely ties into that. So we see then, one of the takeaways I would say is that what we've seen with these national policies, these individual policies, is that they very much mirror or are interwoven with each country's national industrial policy. And this is also largely mirrored on a more general EU level, as Stefan said, especially perhaps in the policy investment guidelines and the EU Commission white paper, these more recent policy documents. And what is noticeable in that mode of policy is, of course, things like fairness, accountability, transparency, and privacy. And these have been addressed multiple times over the years in AI policy in general across the world. They're very mainstream established concerns in many ways. And we could argue that these things, fairness, accountability, transparency, and privacy, are ethical aspects that tend to be understood to be relatively easily addressable by way of technical solutions. they're kind of low-hanging fruits, if you like, in terms of technical administration or technical management. And there are some interesting academic studies preceding this report that we present today. We note this in our introduction chapter. There's one paper by Jobin, Yenka, and Ballena from last year, doing a global survey of 84 different AI policy documents. And likewise, Hagendorf, only this year, is a recent paper doing a global survey of 22 analyzed AI ethics policies. And they find fairly similar things. However, they also point out some kind of blind spots. Hagendorf especially would lament the kind of lack of diversity in the AI community, but also, moreover, the kind of lack in the analysis that he makes of discussions of, for example, political abuse of AI systems and so forth. So I would say that our survey here kind of mirrors that. We don't see much discussion of this in these national AI policies for natural reasons and sometimes for good reasons as well, I suppose. And what we don't see much of either, so this is kind of to run down things that you should expect when you read this book. We don't see so much reflection about the kind of high-level trade negotiations and geopolitical conflicts, for example, although this would arguably be underlying a lot of the way these policies are written in each member country. We don't see discussions about militarization or weaponization of AI either. And what we do see, though, is decidedly this human in the loop aspect. And I'll come back to that briefly. We see hints of discussion about policing and judiciary decision-making. However, because there's also a large international discussion right now of AI-driven automated decision-making, things like implementations that would streamline or make more effective the judicial processes, for example. But of course, there's always a risk there with the lack of human oversight. And we don't see much discussion here in these papers or policies of kind of social and cultural conservating aspects of AI and more kind of philosophical questions. But that's natural in an industrial policy context, I would say. Information security is only slightly kind of addressed in passing, I would say. I mean, Stefan just noted how technical robustness is a key pillar here that is considered. But I would say information security debates in more detail is something that we hope to see emanating from these policies as well. And likewise, these discussions about automation and jobs, that's also something that I know Claire might address shortly, that we don't see much of, or nor do we see much of the environmental issues, as Stefan says. Now, this might sound as a critique here, but I would say that some of these blind spots might be due to the sectoral recommendations that Stefan mentioned being so new as well. So a lot of these national policies in review wouldn't have had time to take more detailed considerations into account. They are kind of quite top-level industrial concerns once again. What is very nice to see, though, is this very natural inclusion of a human in the loop concept. And that also is very neatly connecting to academic debates by people like Lawrence Lessig, Frank Pasquale, Stefan Larsson, myself, and other scholars. Also, we need to consider the GDPR aspect that Europe has seen in the recent years, a very tough measures on legal protections of individual privacy of its citizens. And I think this can be read between the lines in a lot of the policy that is formulated. So that mirrors other legal scholars like Antoinette Rouvroy, I would like to mention as well, who's done marvelous work on this notion of human in the loop, some oversight of decision-making systems that could otherwise be very inhumane. So with that being said, I hand over to Claire, please.
Thank you, Jonas, and thank you for your discussion of these. Picking up from that and building on the idea of the human on the loop, in the loop rather, I want to highlight two things. The one is that these book chapters also draw on the experiences of the countries that have actually been on the cutting edge of technological development and offer a few cautionary tales. So just to highlight that. But then also zooming out from ethics in AI and putting ethics in AI in the context of global trade strategy and global competitiveness, that we can actually see the choice of the EU to emphasize ethics, not just as a moral imperative, although it is that, but also as a competitiveness imperative. So when it comes to the lessons thus far, we've already seen that AI is something that is very much grounded on what a data set looks like, and what it is that the algorithm does. And sometimes, as Jonas says, they end up making recommendations that actually don't make sense to humans, and are black box to some degree. And so unpacking that and having this level of transparency is not just morally important, but it's strategically important in order to make sure that algorithms work as they should and do what it is that they are supposed to do. So we've seen recently, outside the scope of countries, but coming to for-profit firms, that Amazon, for example, recently had an instance of a resume reviewing system that actually discriminated against women. And why was that? When they dug into the system, it was because the underlying data was discriminatory. But if you black box the whole process and you don't have transparency around that, you may run the risk of blindly believing that the data don't lie, or that algorithms and AI have some sort of wonderful objective magic that allows you to make really good decisions. And of course, recent cases have shown otherwise. So just to highlight that, and then talking specifically about examples from countries really on the cutting edge, the Netherlands has used algorithms to detect fraud for a number of years, and in the book chapter here, in this book, Katja de Vries points to these as really things that we need to think about, that you can't just blindly follow an AI. So the one case that she cites is around the Dutch tax office's anti-fraud team, which actually ended up being unnecessarily harsh, and not actually considering extenuating factors, and ending with many thousands of victims who were seen as having been fraudulent on the basis of this AI, and for whom automatic decisions were made, and they ended up being misclassified without transparency, and without the ability for them to really do something about that at short notice. So that's the one case. And the second was around fraud for social benefits. And it actually, ended up having discriminatory effects, discriminating against already marginalized groups. And so these are some of the risks. When you take data out of context, it becomes unfair, and it doesn't actually capture the context that makes certain already vulnerable groups more likely to be represented in data. So that's a really important thing about transparency, is that we have the human in the loop, precisely because we know from extant studies, particularly in organizations, that when you have an algorithm, you also need that expert knowledge complemented with the algorithm in order to reintroduce context, and also to deal with problems around causation versus correlation. So that's really important here. And then zooming out, not just around these cautionary tales, but zooming out into the kind of strategic context of all of this, we've seen very strong signals from the EU, both from GDPR and now from this, that not just the human in the loop, but also this human-centered approach is the way forward. And that really makes sense when you consider other studies in management that have shown that automation has its natural limits, and that augmentation allows for this wonderful complementarity between things that algorithmic intelligence are good at, like data crunching, that kind of thing, and then also things that humans are good at, like making sure that there's representativity, making sure that there's context, and you can really couple that to allow for competitive intelligence. But what we've also seen is that existing data sets, the ones that are just sort of scraped from the internet, have with them very large holes, and have problems associated with them precisely because they're passively generated. They're passively generated as a byproduct of other kinds of processes. And when you have a set of policies like this one that actually doesn't just encourage transparency for its own sake, but tries to build trust with consumers and around consumer data, you build a situation in which people then potentially voluntarily opt in to the collection and generation of that data. And in so doing, you can have more complete data sets, and you can always already then build the preconditions for data marketplaces, which is both a better basis for decisions down the line if we consider that data are likely to be used for decision-making algorithms, but then also for consumers and ordinary individuals to share in the profits that are made from commercializing data by data marketplaces and data analytics. And I think that that's really important, and we've already seen discussions of that on the EU level, moving into kind of data marketplaces. And then lastly, the great competitive advantage for the EU is that there is this enormous European market. And when you have nice harmonized approaches and regulations like this, it allows a company that wants to set up somewhere in the EU to tap not just into the particular country in which they decide to set up, but the marketplace as a whole, knowing that there are harmonized and consistent regulations across the European Union. Not only that, when you have all of these encouraging policies around transparency, and also the kind of carrots and the support from the countries to facilitate doing that, you build a situation in which there are incentives for global international companies to set up bases here, and for startups to know that the rules are clear and they know how it is that they should operate, which then actually is something good, that certainty moving forward, which encourages them to set up in the European Union. So really interesting moving forward, as Jonas said, on the one hand, highlighting the things that the countries have in common, the links to industrial policy, but also pre-existing strengths among the different nations, but then also highlighting these kind of cautionary tales, like for instance, in the case of fraud in the Netherlands and bias that we've seen at commercial firms. But of course, there are still some gaps there, things like weaponization, and I guess that hopefully will come. I'm hoping it's not a blind spot on the part of regulators. It's probably sensitive and something that requires a lot more regulation. But then on the big level, it's this wonderful win-win where you have this nice set of human in the loop, potentially positive for ordinary people kind of approach that also provides strategic incentives for companies to set up and do business in the EU, and then to involve EU expertise in making sure that the AI and algorithms that are used are contextual or contextualized and actually fit for purpose in that way. So really, really useful set of discussions here. But of course, as Jonas says, just the beginning. And I think there's particularly the sectoral recommendations, which are quite new. We have some exciting things to come there.
Thank you both very much. I'm showing up here because it's time to move on. But actually, if we could just keep you here for 1 second. If any readers only have time to read one chapter from this publication, which one would you recommend, both of you?
Oh, I mean, I'm tempted to say the introduction, as we kind of summarize a lot of I mean, we also mentioned quite a lot of national detail in the introduction, a few takeaways from each country that are under review. So, but Yeah, I would say so, but I'm a bit biased as an editor.
And Claire?
I think, look, it depends where they're from, what they're interested in. I mean, context, Robin.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
I agree with Jonas that I think there's a lot of the big picture there in the introduction. I really do also think that the discussion of the Dutch policy is very interesting insofar as it highlights a strategy by a country that has really been on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
So I think that is a really worthwhile reading, perhaps together with the introduction.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we're going to move on, and we will be hearing from Friedrich Heinz, who has written a summary, and he is an associate professor in computer science at Linköping University, and he is president of the Swedish AI Society, and also a member of the EU high-level expert group on AI, which is a long name for an expert group, but it sounds good. Would you like to present your commentary on the publication?
Yes, I very much would like to do that.
Fantastic.
Good. Yeah. So thank you for having me, and also for inviting me to give this commentary. So actually, now that I've been listening to the previous speakers, I did some rapid changes, because I feel that there are a number of commentaries to the commentaries that I would like to make here before I make my commentary. And I think the first one, I think, is very, and then in some sense, it's about the way of working in Europe. I think we like to talk a lot, we like to discuss things, but now we really need to do things. And that, I think, is the major challenge here, to go from all this nice talking to actually achieving something. And I actually put together just some nice charts to kind of why I think this is important. The first slide, or the first chart here, is the total private investment in AI between January 2018 and October 2019. And we can see that the US is absolutely outstanding, and of course it's because they have the big tech companies, but we can also see that the China is also doing extremely well here. And then we have two countries closely related to Europe, but not in the EU, well, at least in a month, UK and Israel. And then we can see that all the other countries come further down. And I think this is the major challenge for Europe. How do we increase the private investment in AI? Because it is an expensive endeavor, especially if you want to go from the nice research prototypes that we are developing, I mean, me as a researcher, to the large scale commercial successes, as we have seen in some cases. And that, I think, is a major challenge for Europe that we really need to address. And we can, and the second challenge for Europe is, how do we stay relevant? I mean, if we look historically, Europe has had a very strong position, especially when it comes to AI research. So this is publications in AI, and we can see that, I mean, Europe has been ahead of the curve all the time. The challenge is, of course, that we are accelerating slower, or rather other countries are accelerating faster. And I think this is, again, is a challenge for Europe. How do we move faster? We are slow and cumbersome, and everything is quite hard to achieve. But when we do it, I mean, I think we do things well. But that, I think, is the second thing. How do we accelerate the development? So we've seen the kind of approach taken by the EU. And I mean, the commentaries we have heard so far, it's quite a lot about this boosting technological and industrial capacity. And of course, my comment regarding the increasing private investment is a major part of this. We have also seen a lot of discussions about ensuring this appropriate ethical and legal frameworks, again, with this ethical guidelines as one of the key examples. But actually, we have seen quite little regarding this preparing for socioeconomic changes. So we are aware that there will be major changes to society, but we are quite poor in preparing for these. And personally, I find this kind of our major, varied success in addressing the global pandemic is unfortunately not a very positive sign that we as a society will be able to really deal with this large global and hard to predict changes. So that's a key thing. Stefan did a good job of describing kind of what we have been doing on the EU level, but I think it's important to show also a number of the things that are coming. So what has been done is, for example, starting 4 networks of research excellence centers in different areas of AI. There is an ongoing work with creating, or there's a call for this digital innovation hubs, which at least one should have an AI focus and be present in each country. So in each country, there should be a digital innovation hub with AI focus. There's ongoing discussions about starting a new private-public partnership in AI, data, and robotics. And with the main goal, of course, to increase the investment from the private side. And there is this equity funds and so on. So there are a bunch of things going on. Of course, everyone expects that there will be a regulation. It will be interesting to see what this regulation really contains. So the initiatives that are ongoing on the kind of research side is that there is a project called AI for EU, which is really trying to build a European scale community and platform for AI. And then we have these 4 ICT4 data networks of research excellence centers, of which I coordinate the one called Taylor on the Foundations for Trustworthy AI, integrating learning, optimization, and reasoning. So there's a lot of things going on. And of course, we have EUREI, the European AI Association, where I'm a board member, and also CLARE, which is a major grassroots organization trying to push the research innovation landscape in Europe. So if we then take my commentary, I would just quickly mention some of the highlights. So the first topic is, of course, the AI definition. So, I mean, as an AI researcher, I find it, there are so many different aspects of it, and it's really difficult to come up with one. And personally, I don't even find it important. I mean, to me, AI will always be the area which is pushing the frontiers, exploring the unknown, and pushing the limits of what computers can do. So it's really about getting computers to do what computers currently cannot do, and often using humans as the kind of example. And of course, but then of course we have the kind of legal perspective on this. And there, I mean, these kind of fluffy definitions will not do. And here my view is that we probably have to focus more on specific use cases. I don't believe that there should be, this is the AI definition and now we regulate around that. I would be quite certain that that would only lead to unintended and unwanted consequences. Because when it comes to these regulatory concerns, I mean, to me, the most important is that humans should be held responsible and accountable. So to me, this is the key thing. I mean, that these things that we build are tools to support us. They're not to replace us. And of course, we have this first principle, the first ethics principle of maintaining human autonomy as the main thing. So I really think this is important. I wanted to make a commentary around, I mean, of course, the idea is to build this single market, but I think it's already today, even with the EU, it's really difficult to set up a company and grow in Europe because there are different languages, there are different cultures, there are different legal systems. So there is a lot of obstacles towards doing this. I really think reducing these obstacles would be a very beneficial thing. And when it comes to research, I think the most important thing here is that Europe cannot be a leader in AI regulation without being a leader in AI. So I really think that we cannot only do the regulation, even though that many people seem to have that view, but rather we also need to lead in the development. Otherwise, we are just regulating what other people build and invent. And likewise, we cannot be a leader in AI application and innovation without being a leader in also the foundational AI research. So it's really important. And I mean, if I take a Swedish perspective, for example, there's a lot of talk. We should be the best in the world in leveraging the potential of AI, but there should be nothing about developing. So basically, and that I think is a dangerous strategy. When it comes to innovation, I think the key thing here is that Europe is pretty good at starting companies, but we're really terrible at growing companies. So when the companies reach certain sizes and need large-scale investors, usually that investment comes from outside the EU because people or investors in EU are not willing to take the risks that other external investors are willing to take, which means that if you, as a CEO of a company looking for investors, goes to European investors, you might get a certain amount for your company. If you then go to, say, American or Asian investors, you might get 10 times that amount. And why would you then sell it to European investors? And that, I think, is a major challenge. But there's also opportunities, and that is kind of the boundaries between research and innovation are small. And so you can quickly move from research to innovation and then to scaling up. We do have a challenge with this fragmented internal market and regulatory difficulties and regulatory uncertainties, which is a challenge. And then maybe what I find the most, I mean, if I were to say only one thing that I think we should really focus on, it is education. And here I think AI will influence all levels of education. So if we're looking at the talent, Europe is basically a netto exporter of talent. So we have good educations when it comes to technical education and so on. The challenge is two. First of all, we're poor at keeping the talent in Europe. They prefer to move elsewhere because there are better conditions and more interesting work and so on and so forth. And secondly, we have a challenge when it comes to dual or combined competences, especially now from a Swedish perspective, is that we don't have like lawyers who also understand technology, or we don't have nurses who also understand technology, and HR people that understand AI and this digital technology and so on. So we really need to increase the digital understanding of digital technology throughout all the education system. And of course, we need to work with upskilling and reskilling. So, I mean, I belong to those that believe that more or less every job will be influenced by digitalization and AI, which means that everyone needs to change the way that they're working and learn how to leverage these tools. And here we have a major challenge. And of course, these are also very slow and conservative areas. So we really need to start early. Yeah, we have to start yesterday. Second last is that scale. I mean, we're pretty good at doing things on medium scale. We're good at distributing things, but what we lack is scaling up. If we want to have really make a difference, we really need to concentrate. I mean, we have to combine, this regional and local efforts with also centralized efforts. And I really think this idea that in the white paper about the Lighthouse Center is absolutely essential. In the end, of course, what we want, I think here EU and Europe is doing the exactly right thing, saying that, yes, we want AI, but we don't want any AI. And that we should really focus AI made in Europe on AI for good and AI for all. And if we do that, I think we have a bright future ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation as well. And I'd just like to quickly mention that this commentary is part of the publication, which can be downloaded on our website and on the website of ELF. We are going to move on to Francesco shortly, and then we will get back with some questions in the panel. And I do have some questions for you, so I hope you will stick around. Thank you. And then it's time for Francesco, who is a research fellow connected to ELF and who is also an author of a chapter in the publication. So maybe you could give a short introduction of you and your chapter.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's one of the yeah, okay. Thank you for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity of contributing. Very briefly, I start with my very short presentation, trying to underline some findings from the Italian perspective. What Professor Haynes said is very inspiring, especially the part of regulating what other people create. I mean, all the chapters, but Italian strategy especially, are trying to regulate something that is not 100% in-house created. But before going into the strategy of artificial intelligence, something about Italy, and very important, is the division of competencies that is made in the European digital, let's call it this, ecosystem. Indeed, we have different actors involved in the digitalization project, which aim at being a 360-degree digitalization, both for citizens and business, promoting sustainable digitalization, which, but more in the sense of the United Nations Sustainable Goals. And here you can see the Ministry of Technological and Innovation, and especially the three, let's say, main work that are produced behind this ministry are Italia 2025, which is the general plan for digitalizing Italy, a 3-year plan, which is renewed with a certain objective for bringing the digital means into the public administration, and a curiosity, the white paper on artificial intelligence that was published in 2018 by the Agency for Digital Italy, that were referring to some basic things that we can find also in all the other publications concerning artificial intelligence. For instance, is a technology neutral? Well, so can we say, or in a different way, we can pose, it's an algorithm harmful? I mean, you have no responsibility. So I can connect to what Professor Haynes said. So the humans are responsible for the implementation. But some minimum safety measures are requested. And so back in 2018, the Agency for Digital Italy referred to that. But the main point is because they really want to use the artificial intelligence means in the public administration system. So something that is very, the core of these, both these strategies, if we can say two strategies, right? Is the way how to create a digital environment that can involve the public administration, fostering the general infrastructure. And the question that can be answered by all the document, reading all the document, is interoperability. So the way of creating a better institutional structure. Indeed, the Ministry for Economic Development made this proposal on an Italian AI strategy, first version in 2019, then also taking into account something from the European Union Commission's guidelines. Another publication were made this year in July. And indeed, the basic point is to rethink the institutional structure, to better evaluate the correct policy that can be implemented, to better evaluate the necessary partnerships, and in the end, also to achieve smart government. Let me say that the main point of this strategy is to foster high-level research, creating innovative policies, especially bringing into the discussion the role of small and medium enterprises, because it is not something apart that in Italy, cannot be precise with that, but from 89 to 95% of enterprises are small and medium enterprises. So using this technology in not only in strategic sectors for the Italian productive sector, like robotics, automotive, and but also implementing those in the small and medium enterprises is one of the goals. But let me go, because I want to be very brief and give space for the discussion, which seems to me very interesting, also to understand something else about different perspectives. Let me just show you a picture from the strategy that was analyzed and that showed the proposal of this structure. As you can see, it is in Italian, but I will be briefly translating. The structure is pyramidal structure, where you see the prime minister, so the council of ministers at the top, getting input both from some institute that should be created, especially for artificial intelligence, since the Italian Institute for Artificial Intelligence, which is in charge of the top quality research, attracting funding, creating a network at the European international level of excellencies, but also for the technological transfer. And getting the input from the industry and the research sector. Now, I highlighted in my short comment about the strategy, short chapter, that this poses some guarantees because citizens can go indeed through the democratic processes and intervene in these let's say, oversight, in this control from the prime minister electing the government. But at the same time, given the peculiarities of Italian governmental structure, and the way that, for instance, if we think in a 10-year perspective, we change 7, 8 governments, it's kind of difficult to think, in my personal opinion, in a very long-term perspective, given what also Professor Haynes said, that there is something that should be done, some research, some goal that should be achieved in the artificial intelligence field, but thinking in a middle term or long-term perspective. So binding that much to the willing of the government and the political environment, all this strategy is a risk. That can be that can facilitate indeed the approval of some necessary amendments, laws, decrees. But at the same time, if we have a repentant change of government, what can happen if they decide not to follow this path? Let me briefly wrap up saying that kind of some peculiarities of the strategy. They took into account the general guidelines, especially when talking about reliability of the artificial intelligence in the sectors of industry or public sector, and bringing the concept of ethics by design, meaning that through all the processes of implementation, some safety measures should be implemented, but not only, because indeed the strategy say that this is something reductive, because there is a need of safety and robustness of the whole system. So all the actors should be submitted and should be responsible for minimum requirements. So for instance, the ethical principles should apply in this regard. Some legal standards should be applied, and technical requirement to be implemented in the application of this technology. And one point which is typical of this word game, let's say, Italian Renaissance is a peculiarity of this strategy, which is the aim, the intention of the government to achieve evidence-based policy making in artificial intelligence, given the structure, so given the fact that they are in continuous receiving feedback from both the technical and research and industry. And creating also policy based on ex-ante verification through what I call regulatory sandboxes. So applying in a small and protected environment some for instance, law that can permit some experimentation of new technology. And as I said before, to conclude, there is a general alignment with the European Union guidelines, even though they clearly express that this is a target toward which to tend, because there are some, and in my opinion, many peculiarities in the Italian ecosystem, in the Italian structure, not only from the point of view of the administration, but also from infrastructure that should be taken into account before thinking only on regulation. And that's all from my point of view, because I want to keep it very brief and looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. It's very nice that we could have a presentation of a national analysis too. But with that, I would like to invite all the panelists to join us at the same time now for some questions. And actually, the first one I think is mostly for Fredrik. As I said, we do have some questions from YouTube as well. So I'm sort of bringing one in. And you mentioned that it's a bit of a moving target. And we also have a question about the future harms of AI. So how can we sort of categorize them, and how can we make sure that we have strategies that last for some time? So my question is basically, how do you think that these initiatives that we're seeing today, you're involved in many of them, do we think that they are enough? And are they doing enough to sort of categorize the future effects of AI to make sure that they last for longer than a few months?
So, I mean, well, I guess a personal perspective, I mean, I'm not particularly worried about the technique itself. I'm more worried about people than technology. And I think the major challenge with these technologies in general is that now we have to start to discuss our values and our norms explicitly, because what we see is that when we start implementing what we thought we actually wanted, and then we see the consequences of these, what we thought we wanted, then we don't like it. So to me, I mean, I think many of these discussions about, say, discrimination in automated decision-making systems, to me, it's a much more of a reflection of us, and that previously it was more hidden because it was some individual who made this, and they were probably good at kind of making up a good excuse for why it's not discrimination. And now we have an automated system doing exactly the same decision, but now it can explicitly look at it. We can explicitly study why it was making that decision. We can explicitly realize that, well, this was probably not a very good decision. And to me, I think this will be the major long-term challenge. How can we as humans start accepting that we are maybe not as good as we thought we were? And how can we learn to improve through, I mean, to me, it's still about AI and people. And I think we can learn a lot, and we can improve our human decision-making procedures by using these tools in a smart way.
Claire, you look like you had something to say. Was it?
No, absolutely. I see that as an enormous positive, where suddenly processes that were black boxed for different reasons because they were inside some human's head are actually now apparent. And so you can have the best of both worlds. On the one hand, you can have the transparency of this algorithmic decision making, and you can have scrutiny and contextualization by humans. So there's this augmentation of things that everybody, algorithms and people are good at. So absolutely, it's a definite improvement on let's still call it the status quo, because mostly decision making is still done by humans, but we're moving in a more algorithmic direction.
Can I chip in a thought as well? Because I totally agree with both Fredrik and Claire here, and I think we could illustrate this by also contemplating what do we mean by industrial policy then, or investment in equitable and actionable research. Because take, for example, one of the very latest algorithms, GPT-3, which is a cutting edge language model, AI model from OpenAI. Once an algorithm, a new algorithm is out of the box, it kind of scales very quickly, in the sense that a lot of other companies can use this model in various ways. But the core interesting thing for society is really how you use that. How do you implement it? But that's still a technical thing. It still requires a lot of technical innovation, right? So, like, how to build systems that use GPT-3 and have technical ways of vetting the results and weighing the results and so forth. Is that kind of, Fredrik, if I'm passing the ball to you again, is that what you think here, like, is key to the future investment?
So, I mean, there are several things. I mean, one thing is, of course, this kind of combination. I mean, if you're a journalist using GPT-3 in your everyday work, I mean, how do you do it? And how do you, I mean, it's actually, I think that's also interesting from this kind of upskilling and reskilling perspective. I mean, how do you write a text when you use GPT-3 as one of your tools for doing that? But this, going back to my previous comments, I would say that in some sense, now I'm overstating a little bit, but not too much, and say that as long as you define what you mean by fair in a mathematically well-defined sense, we can implement it. But then you have to agree what you mean by fairness. How should we do this, or justice, or some other contentious term? And there, I think, is the challenge. So in some sense, extrapolating from that, I believe that every decision-making which should only be done using clear rules, they should be implemented. But then, of course, all the decisions that we don't believe we can come up with clear rules for how to do things, that should be done by people. But then we cannot expect people to follow rules, but rather they have to follow norms or values, or I mean something more general. So in some sense, what Claire was mentioned about context. And to me, I think that's. I think we will need to rethink, in some sense, how we do a lot of things. Because now I would see that our ideal is to be like computers. We want every rule to be declarative, known in advance, and that there should be only one clear interpretation of it. And if you can achieve that, that's great. Then just implement it in a computer and you're done. But I would expect that most interesting rules will not be of that kind.
But can I just ask something there? It sounds like the problem is mainly then that we don't really know what we want. We haven't defined what we want out of these, what we want to use these tools for. Is that a correct interpretation of the discussion, or is it just me?
No, but I mean, I think, well, two things. I think, first of all, I think it's a very hard question, what we want. and also, many times, when we get what we thought we wanted, we realize that that's not actually what we wanted. And I mean, I think this, what is it called? Spirit in the lamp? I'm not sure what that's in English. You know, Aladdin thing. And that you get three wishes. Yeah. And the third wish is always, please undo the previous two wishes.
That's very good.
And Stefan, you had something to add to that, or was it?
No? Genie in a bottle. Thank you, everyone, for. I'm back, but it was a great presentation, by the way. I agree with we don't know what we want. That's actually the core of many of the tricky questions. They are called wicked sometimes, or maybe any democracy shows that it's a struggle with some of the topics, because it's more of a balancing issue of different interests, and you need to find that balance, which is sometimes just a struggle, and it's hard, and always some parties will be not happy with that solution, as opposed to problems where you can truly sort of set a goal and optimize towards that goal. It's a different set of challenges. That's why some of the issues we will never be satisfyingly, optimizing for. It's more a balancing of interest. That's why like fairness questions are particularly tricky to code, in a sense, because they depend on cultures or norms, in a sense, which are not easily optimized.
And moreover, a brief note, if the regulators were to precede the innovators, that would mean that the regulators would be more innovative than the innovators, right? And that's also quite, a logical, it's kind of putting the cart before the horse, so to speak,
Yeah, and there is actually, in sociology of law, you have research from back to the 1800s saying how hard that is. It's pretty impossible to regulate ahead. But that being said, you can always innovate in terms of making regulatory machinery quicker, which is also a problem. Sometimes it's just too slow. That's not a good solution. Yeah. So more of the interplay between technology and regulation, I would see, which is also the sandbox idea. And you see some attempts on that in some other countries.
Claire?
But also this laws made before the innovations use deliberately incomplete language for the purpose of it being interpreted as innovations develop later. So that's something that we're identifying here as a feature can also be a flaw, because it allows for space not only for individual states to interpret things like fairness in line with their own cultures and norms, while still having some sort of overarching harmonized position, but it also leaves space for those things to evolve over time. Which is very important, and then allows, hopefully, maybe I'm the optimist here, to be able to respond to some of these unintended externalities. One thing that I just want to flag here, that not really apropos law, but apropos transparency and explainability of algorithms, is a lot of this is an ex post solution, right? Once something has happened, once the algorithm has been built, once the algorithm has been executed, then after the fact you can go through it and you can look through it and see how it worked, whatever the case may be. And I think that there's, and maybe this is what is part of fairness, and is something that I don't see in this discussion and I would have liked to see, is some sort of ex ante, whether it's representativity or design concerns. What is consistently a problem is the underrepresentation of weaker groups, and in particular, as the only woman among the six of us, something that the tech industry is historically not very good at, is including female voices, the voices of people of different ethnicities, and also the people of, or rather the voices of people that are socioeconomically less advantaged. And that is something in fairness that is incredibly hard to legislate, and I'm not sure that we should expect it necessarily of the EU. No. But that if somehow in practice that could be an ex ante thing that we could see, it would be good, not just for ethics but also for competitiveness, because of course these marginalized groups are still consumers, and so having their voices is not just ethically good, it's good for bottom lines, if you will.
We should mention that we have several female authors in the anthology. It's we tried very well.
Francesco had something to add too.
Yeah, just some reflection, but what would ask you maybe, because you pointed out about the underrepresented groups, but we should take into account something, because probably I'm studied more extensively in international relations, so systemic approaches. Something very basic for everyone that should take into account is that politics matter. So in the end, the majority, so the voters matter. And this is connected to a discussion that was not taken into account before, but can be relevant, which is the misinformation about this technology. It was the same, for instance, for the deployment of 5G infrastructure. You have seen how many no 5G groups are arising, not populism, not necessarily, but extremist or whatever, Novax, for instance. So when the discussion will start about this new technology, we should take also this fact into account, because we can create the better strategy, we can achieve the better results in technological field, but in the end, who will post the final signature in the decree will be the politician. And that's why I stressed that on the presentation. I mean, I hope that everyone, and especially the industrial sector, could take advantages from the deployment of this technology, and it will. There are some examples. But how to tackle this problem, seeing the trend in the past 6-10 years toward this, not populist, but we are liberals, we can say populist, but too easy, but toward this extremist approach, because it goes beyond any discussion that can be done from a technician, from a lawyer, from the end of political science. This is something to take into account, in my opinion. So
good point.
Fredrik, did you have something to add to that, or a response?
Yes. So, I mean, there are many things to say. I mean, when it comes to politicians, it seems to me the major challenge is the short-sightedness. And because, I mean, it's too much focus on what the voters want today, not what they will need in 10 years, because I think Yeah, but that's one thing. But I also think you're pointing at actually something that I do think is very important, that is to make sure that the benefits are spread throughout society. So I completely agree with Claire's statement here about representation. I do think that's a major weakness and a major challenge, how to achieve better representation. And likewise, I also think it's equally important that the kind of benefits are also spread throughout society. And my expectation there is that by reducing the differences in societies, then you will also reduce the kind of susceptibility to different forms of extremism and so on. Because I really think people just want to have a better life. And if we can help them have that, I think most will be happy about that.
Jonas, we do have to wrap up shortly. I'll just flag that, but Jonas.
No, I just think that this is a very nice point to address as well, the good life, the better life, because what we also haven't talked about today is the environmental concern, and which is a very, very burning issue. It's very, we don't have much time now. We need to change some fundamental parameters in society. But I think from a liberal democratic point of view, we need to retain the idea of the good life, the good, welfare for human beings, whilst doing this large transformation of society. And AI and digital technology fits into this perfectly. I mean, it's really built for optimizing various processes, right? Industrial processes, not the least. And material processes that take energy. So we should address that. Maybe that's a future book for another book.
I'm going to ask if anyone has something, any last comments before I start wrapping up then.
I would love
Stefan?
to.
Yeah?
I would love to talk for yet an hour. No, I think the AI and the environmental, I think that needs to be stressed more. I agree with that. But that also links to data infrastructures, I would say. We have talked very little about data and the role of data, which is often sort of contemporary AI depends on data access. So that will be calming discourse that we will continue. It's not all related to just AI, because like Francesco pointed out, digitization, and there are a bunch of issues related to that the AI debate right now kind of sucks in. But sure, environmental issues, I would love to stress more, and relationship to data infrastructures, which is the material side to it, basically.
Claire, your last comment.
Tiny thing. Frederick mentioned in passing the difficulties that the EU or many EU nations have had in taking research and innovation and commercializing it and attracting private and venture capital. And I think that that's really something that goes under the category of making AI happen, that we really need to see. Maybe it's even the European diaspora, I highlight that there is competence, but there is also a legal framework that creates certainty for the creation of and commercialization of AI innovation, and hopefully that will attract some of that private capital. But then, of course, there are strategies as well from nation states to encourage and to grow that investments domestically, and maybe that needs to be earmarked for AI basic research, not just the applied and inspired stuff.
Francesco, just before we end.
Oh, but just to wrap up, I would like to ask you some feedback on that. We are at the dawn of a new era, the era of automated intelligent machines and so on. But do you think that we really need, and this is just general, out of the publication, do you think that we really need, because what concerns us is security, no? So we have the example of the GDPR, so the privacy, cybersecurity, which have extensive way deepened for instance, aspects such as public-private partnerships. And so if we think and probably in artificial intelligence, we can go through some example. And I mean, can we learn something from what already exists and not over-regulating, which is for the market not necessarily good? I mean, a freer market could be indeed good, even in the field of artificial intelligence. I don't know, but and so I would like to ask you what you think about. Can we learn something without keeping the regulation going? So bureaucratizing the procedures because it has no answer, potentially many threats and many regulation needed.
One sentence answers from any of you.
Well, one sentence from me is that you wouldn't have to know what to optimize for. So there would have to be a greater vision in society, especially among politicians, like Fredrik said, that we can have for long term. Yeah.
Okay. That was one sentence. Very good. I'm very sorry. I also would like to go on for days with this, but we do have to wrap up. So I'd like to thank you all again. And I'm also going to say to anyone watching to check out the Liberal Europe podcast, where we will also be going on about this. And we will also be publishing some summaries and the publication and some interviews coming up after this. So the discussion will keep on going. But with that, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.